make this clear. I'm one of those kind of speakers that if I ask a question or say something that requires an audience response, you all should respond. So let's try this again. Good evening. Good evening. All right. Helps me know that I'm not alone. I'd like to thank the organizing committee. I appreciate that you all have put this together, and I appreciate that you all selected me to participate in this. And I'd like to thank you all for listening carefully and attentively this evening. Let's see if I can do this right. Okay, so I'm here today to talk to you about race, teaching, literature, and history, and hopefully in an exciting manner. As I prepared for this evening, I thought up a whole roster of ideas and stories to share, but I kept coming up against the same question. How did I get here on this stage at this university? And I was reminded of a conversation that I had at a high school alum event. And one of my former classmates came up to me and we shared the obligatory greeting. And at some point she asked me, "What do you do for a living?" It's a simple enough question with a simple enough response. So I said, "I'm an assistant professor. I teach introductory courses in African American literature at Towson University. But on this particular day, at this particular event, I didn't stop there. I did something crazy. I said, this means that I discuss race and literature in the United States every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday." Her response surprised me. She looked at me and said, "Oh my gosh, why ever would you discuss race so many days out of the week?" Oh. And I don't know if it was the point in time in the semester or just my sheer shock in her response. I looked at her and was like, I don't even know. I don't even know. In the days and months and weeks following though, I took time to think about, what my real answer would be. And it's actually quite simple. That's me on a bench. It's me pretending to be an assistant professor. Real or otherwise. My answer is really quite simple. I'm an educator. I teach African American literature, so that means I have to discuss the racial and political history of the United States. I use literature, or I teach literature because it serves as a means to imagine a world outside of ones that we know so well. And I use the text and print and social and visual media to connect the world of the text to the reality of the classroom and the communities within which my students live and learn. And I begin every semester mobilized by this mission. Now, at the time, I had no idea that the question, what do you do for a living, would prompt me to investigate my purpose as a scholar, a teacher, and a writer, but it did. Now, truth be told, I think that is a great story, but it actually fails to answer the how did I get here question. For that, I had to go back further in time to a story that found its way into nearly every family dinner and holiday dinner discussion that I can remember. It begins with my grandmother and her oldest son, Vernon. Vernon came to my grandmother one day and said, "Mom, I don't want to go to Frederick Douglass High School. I want to go to the Baltimore Polytechnic Institute." Anyone here go to Poly? Dang, go figure. So my grandmother, hearing the earnestness of her son, said, "All right, now here's where the story gets really good. His request came before Brown versus the Board of Education. What does this mean? Schools in Baltimore City were segregated by law, not through the de facto and creative means that might exist now. So law was on the side of the segregationists, and Poly was a school for white boys. But in spite of these facts, my grandmother decided that her son would go to the school board, or would go to Poly. So she went to the school board and took the necessary action. But here's where the historical memory gets spotty. I have no idea what the conversation was or with whom. I don't know if my grandmother, who was 5 foot tall and God-fearing, cussed somebody out that day, or if she quietly prayed for the entry of her son into his first choice school. What I do know is that my uncle enrolled in Poly's A course and graduated, and he went on to Johns Hopkins University, and it's, lived a long life. We still live, as a matter of fact. We won't get into all of that. What I learned also from this story is the value of education, and maybe even something a bit more important. I learned of the necessity of social activism. But it's not the social activism that we learned about in middle and high school. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were actually not there that day with my grandmother at the school board. Rosa Parks wasn't even a household name. But no, this activism was ordinary and individual, and it emerges out of an even more powerful act, the telling of a new story, and therefore a reimagining of what's possible. So when my grandmother decided that her son was to go to Poly, she left behind the story in which her son couldn't go to the white high school. She revised that tale, and in so doing, she made, created, and spoke a new world. And it was remade, recreated, and revised every time she told that story, and she told it a lot. I learned the power of the word, which when coupled with the need to act, makes transformative changes. And we must understand that to make a new world, we have to do the following. We have to take the risk to tell the new story. And we have to be certain that despite our fears in telling a new story, that we're willing to take the action necessary to make it happen. And in the midst of it all, somehow be certain that what we're doing will create the change that we imagine. I bring this knowledge, this tendency towards hearing and revising stories, into my classroom. And by way of teaching, I've discovered that we've gotten away from understanding or even hearing the power of our words, unfortunately. History is passed, but not passed on. I hear often of, this is my favorite, modern times and olden days, but there seems to be a limited recognition of the ways in which modern times exist because of olden days. It seems that because our president is Black, the United States no longer has a history of racialized violence and white supremacy. This history is gone, and so are the problems that plague our society. There's no need for social activism because there are no problems, right? No, okay, he says no. He's like, absolutely not. Wrong, and that's what I was gonna say, wrong. We know this is wrong if we think back to a few months ago when the sidewalks and various walls of this campus were chalked with phrases that seemed to recall those olden days. One chalking proclaims anti-racism is anti-white. Another quite simply said white pride. And in every one of my classes that week, we discussed youth for Western civilization. And in nearly every class, someone asked the question, but what's wrong with white pride? It was a question that I could only answer by going back in time to those images, those stories, and those words that we had not adequately passed on. I realized that my students had never heard of a white citizens council that too sought to preserve Americanism and defend the morals of the West, albeit through extra-legal means and fear tactics. I had to share the writings of authors past that documented the horrors and privileges enacted in the name of white pride. I had to show those strange fruits, those lynched bodies hang from trees in the name of white pride. And of course, I was reminded of the white pride that tried to deny my uncle access to the school of his choice. In the midst of these discussions, I returned again and again to my mission, to educate, to use literature to imagine worlds outside those we know, to journey to olden times in order to record and connect and transform our present times. We don't live in a world simply born out of Facebook, Twitter, and other modes of social media. What's relevant need not be considered what's hot on Pinterest and Instagram, though the Instagram filters really do make photos look nice. I can't lie. Instead, we live in a world mobilized by the stories we live, the stories we remember, and those stories that we don't even yet know. It's our job to create, write, live, and speak those stories that need revision. And racism, of course, demands such a revision. To accomplish this end, we don't need to pretend that racism died with Obama's election. We don't need to pretend that racism looks like evil men in hoods or the black and white photographs of bygone days. We need to say no to it when it's in our faces and on our sidewalks, and when it finds its way into our conversations and meanders sneakily into our friendships and family dinners. This semester, I teach a Towson seminar, and we often discuss these matters in class. As one student pointed out to me, she said, you know, we always talk about the problems of white supremacy in this class. And I said, we do. She was like, yeah, every class, that's what we talk about. And I was like, yep, we sure do. And that was all she said, and I felt emotional. I was like, she nailed it. That is what this class is about, yes. It's like someone has been listening. So in this same class with my students, a student of mine suggested that we do a public service announcement. At this point, the campus was abuzz with discussions of youthful Western civilization, and news of Trayvon Martin was finding its way into discussions and activism on campus. And of course, we discussed these matters in class. And other students, upon thinking about public service announcements and whether or not they would want to shoot a video or write a research paper, nodded their heads in agreement. Yes, we want to do a public service announcement, and I have to write a final paper. So I said, you know what, I think this is a good idea. It took a little bit of convincing, but I decided to go forth and do it with them. And they wanted to make their public service announcement to let their fellow students know what they had learned in class, or at least talked about in class. That one way to stop violence, physical, verbal, emotional, maybe one must learn history. One must hear stories and tell stories and use those words to create something new, maybe an idea, a thought, a world even. So together we worked to convey the lessons learned by way of these conversations, and the message was simple: stop violence and instead learn history. So I'd like to close out this evening with the words of the public service announcement. It would have been cute to show you all video, but unfortunately it's still being edited. So instead I will offer the words of the public service announcement to you. W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Over a century later, the problem still remains. Sure, it doesn't look like the lynch law of violence that Ida B. Wells fought against. It doesn't look like the discriminatory practices mandated by law that Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Edie Nixon, and Georgiana Locke protested long ago. We've replaced the lynch law, the lynch mobs that killed Emmett Till with a generalized suspicion. What does suspicious look like? We've got some options here. There are more though. No. James Baldwin called it a fearful and delicate problem. But what's the solution to the acts of racial violence that killed Trayvon Martin and smeared our campus with racial slurs? Well, we have to sympathize with one another. We must create peace and reach for experience. It's understanding cultures and learning history. Let's raise awareness and create equality. Baldwin said, love takes off the mask that we fear we cannot live without and know that we cannot live within. Love solves the violence that fear creates. Stop violence, learn history. Thank you.